to First. I'm Shirley Min along with Michelle Colston and Mark Eichman. The cleanup of Mirror Lake in Dover is what Delaware would like to see in water quality statewide. We begin with a report on the state of our water.
We've invited Dr. Payne to compare some of the findings in his People's Report about Wilmington to the current situation in Baltimore. There are some similarities.
And we learn what it takes to be a firefighter. It's part of our continuing education series, Teach Me. First, your public media news magazine starts now.
A few weeks ago, a group of people came together for the 24th annual Christina River cleanup. People of all ages came together for a single purpose.
I do a lot of kayaking and boating on this river and various other rivers in the area. And with the amount of trash that shows up, someone has to come in and clean it up.
Looking at the variety of the trash and the amount, it certainly raises awareness about what it takes to keep our waterways clean. WHYY is undertaking a 2-year project to bring you stories about the way we use our rivers, ponds, and streams. Look for our stories online, on the radio, and right here on First. We begin with an assessment of Delaware's water health. It's our first look. Except for the beaches, nearly all of Delaware's waterways are polluted.
We can't eat our fish from the St. Jones. We can't swim in too many parts of the inland bays. The Christina and Brandywine rivers are laced with toxic pollutants. This is embarrassing. This is unacceptable. And we must change it.
But paying for that change came with a proposed $45 annual fee, and no one was buying.
The proposal really was intended to generate additional financial resources to accelerate a lot of the good work that we've done.
And some of the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Control's good work can be seen here at Mirror Lake in Dover.
We've had a fish advisory in place for Mirror Lake for several decades, since 1988.
The problem? PCBs.
Those are polychlorinated biphenyls. They're not used anymore. They are really legacy contaminants.
And if you eat enough of them, you can get sick.
Back before there were strong federal, state, local laws and regulations, there were a lot of contaminants that were released to the environment that are very persistent. They don't break down easily. They're also toxic.
Without any intervention, Rick Green and Denrec hydrologist John Cargill estimated it would be 50 years before the state could lift the fish advisory. But they wanted to speed things up.
Approximately a year and a half ago, we had applied approximately 80 tons of an activated carbon product called sedimite to the pond itself.
Once the carbon's holding on to that contaminant, it's not free to be in the water or dissolved in the water and get into those critters that are living and eating and working there in that bioactive zone. And then, it stops that migration up the food chain.
We've gotten a 60% reduction in the PCB concentration in the fish in a single year. We're hoping for a 70 to 90% reduction in 3 to 5 years. So we are well on our way.
At the end of the day, what an amazing test that we've done here, and now we know we can use it other places in the state.
The $1 million cleanup and restoration project was part of the state's Watershed Approach to Toxics Assessment and Restoration Project, or WATAR. Under the initiative, Denrec monitors the state's watersheds against those stubborn contaminants by taking sediment, water, and fish tissue samples. Based on the results, the state prioritizes where to do cleanups and funnel resources. So how did our water get so bad? Over the past century, Delaware's industrial and agricultural past, poor wastewater management, as well as lax regulation over stormwater runoff, all had a hand in dirtying our waterways.
We are living with a legacy of uninformed practices, I should say, maybe, where we've applied a lot of material to the land that over time we've come to learn have an impact on our soils and our water quality.
Now that we know better, Small says for the first time since 1990, new stormwater regulations are in place, as well as stricter standards on septic systems. Changes to industrial and farming practices also help to keep any new contamination out. changes that are already starting to pay off. Take the riverfront, for example. For decades, heavy industry lived along the banks of the Christina.
That land has been repurposed. It's providing, additional revenues to the city and the county. And we've been able to work with developers to get that area cleaned up so that the impacts to the Christina are much, much reduced now.
The inland bays, they're still not 100% safe for swimming, but bacteria levels have improved.
Millions of dollars have been invested in cleaning up the bays. We've eliminated about 12 wastewater systems that used to discharge directly to those bays. There was no fishery that really survived north of Wilmington because the water quality was so poor. The oxygen levels really were very suppressed, and it couldn't support life. That's changed dramatically in 3 or 4 decades.
Yes, decades. Change comes slowly, especially when it comes to cleaning up water. But help from volunteers and nonprofit groups helps shave off the years. And while many of us might not reap the benefits in our lifetime, the state is hoping the next generation will. There's also a financial incentive to cleaning up our waterways. Tourism is a multi-billion-dollar industry in our state. Now picture the dollar signs if more options for ecotourism are offered. A recent UD study showed that for every dollar the state invests in cleaning up its waterways, there's a $17 return to the economy.
That's big money. But Governor Markell, unable to get his Clean Water Initiative passed in the General Assembly in the past year, has that hindered what DENREC's been able to do to clean the water?
Well, cleanup, stormwater, wastewater upgrades, those are the biggest parts of DENREC's budget. Now, had that $45 annual fee been passed, all it would have meant would be that DENREC could accomplish a lot more and faster. But the priorities are still the same. They just can't do it as quickly. In your piece, we saw what's being done at Mirror Lake and the success there. Is that technology something that can then be translated to other waterways in the state? Is that being done? It can, and it is going to be. The technology is going to be applied to Little Mill Creek in a pretty industrialized part of Newcastle County. And hydrologist John Cargill tells me that tests and assessments on the Brandywine, Christina, and Shellpot will be conducted this fall. All right, Shirley, thanks so much. This report kicks off the Delaware part of a 2-year tri-state water project at WHYY and newsworks.org. How the state budgets for these projects is important, and the man who's had a big impact on the state's economy for the last 6 years, Alan Levin, is our first person this week. Secretary Alan Levin of DETO, thanks so much for joining us on First Person.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Earlier this month, you announced your plans to leave your position as director of the Delaware Economic Development Office. Take us through your decision. Why are you leaving the Markell administration?
Well, first of all, it's been a great honor to serve for over the last 6.5 years with the governor. DETO obviously was at the forefront of a lot of things that went on over the last, since the governor came into office. We experienced the worst recession in the history of the world, not just the nation. I'm happy to say that we've weathered that storm. We've kind of turned the corner. We went from a high unemployment rate of 8.7 down to 4.6 where we are today. So from my perspective, I was given an opportunity. A very good friend of mine, Matt Haley, who was the leader and founder of the Sodell restaurant group down in Sussex County, was unfortunately killed in a motorcycle accident last August, and have been working with his team since then, helping them more or less, helping them counsel them in some ways. This opportunity came up. It's a great opportunity, and it seemed like the right time. There's 1.5 years left in the administration. I think I've done what I could do at this point. I think it's time for a fresh set of eyes to kind of look at things, and even though the fresh set of eyes is my deputy, right, who I've certainly worked with over the last 6.5 years and actually 30 years before that, during my career at Happy Harry's. It's time to kind of move on, and this gives me an opportunity to help a friend, to help continue his legacy, and it also, although this didn't enter all into it, I get the chance to work with my son. My son is their director of human resources.
You mentioned the difficult economic mountain, really, that the state and the nation faced in 2009 and in the following years. Talk about what you think is the biggest accomplishment over the course of that difficulty. What is the best thing the state did economically in overcoming that? What was the high point?
Well, I think the high point, I mean, we can talk about individual companies, but we can also talk about the opportunities that I think we took this adversity and made better. And that was to train our workforce. We have got a more productive, a better trained workforce, one that is ready for not just the jobs of today, but the jobs for tomorrow. Obviously, biggest victories, I guess, would be the refinery. Putting the lights back on there was a huge accomplishment for the governor. And when you look at that, bringing back the banks, we're the only state in the union where banks are growing. And it's not just one bank, it's across the board. And it's because we have the right personnel in place, the right workforce for these banks to hire from.
Can't let you go without talking about some of the valleys, and
Sure.
Fisker obviously is probably at the top of that list. Their efforts to, or I guess the efforts to lure them to remake the GM plant on Boxwood Road in Newport. Why did that not happen? Was the state misled in what Fisker could do or their standing? Give us your kind of take on that.
Well, I guess we can all look at it in different ways. I personally think the state lived up to every one of its obligations. I do not believe that the federal government did. I think politics played a big role. When Solyndra failed, the federal government pulled out of every one of these conservation programs, if you will. This was an energy conservation program. That hurt us. It hurt us a lot. Regardless of the $20 million that we spent on that, more importantly, the 2,400 jobs that we were hoping that would go into that facility. If things were different, I think they would have been successful.
As a businessman and someone who sees how government works kind of and can affect business, where do you stand on the idea of raising the minimum wage?
I do not believe that this is the time to raise the minimum wage. I think we have seen over and above what we've already done. First of all, I think that when you consider where we are today, the economy is still fragile, not just here, but everywhere else. But you are seeing companies, because of economic pressures, the Walmarts of the world, the McDonald's, Target, they are all now raising their starting wages. And that's the way the system is supposed to work. When there is not a glut of employment there, companies have to react, and they do accordingly. Massaging or artificially stimulating the economy in that way doesn't usually work well.
All right, Alan Levin, the current director of the Delaware Economic Development Office for this month. Thanks for joining us on as First Person. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks, Mark.
Hey, good luck.
Thank you.
The People's Report Project, as it is known, found that a sense of hopelessness in the future is one of the root causes to violence. That can be translated in not having a job or even a place to belong. That sense of hopelessness is one of the things we heard in the aftermath of the Baltimore unrest. So we've asked University of Delaware Associate Professor of Black American Studies and the People's Project author, Dr. Yasha Payne, to join us. And Dr. Payne, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so when you heard people talking about the state of the economy as one of the reasons behind the riots in Baltimore, did you exactly understand what they were saying?
Absolutely, and definitely it reminded me of the work here in Wilmington, Delaware that we conducted on the People's Report. Our argument has been structural violence is predictive of the physical violence that we see. When we look at the neighborhood, Sandtown, Winchester, the neighborhood where Freddie Gray is from, keep in mind 1/3 of the people are unemployed, one third of the people are impoverished, 22% or so are unemployed, right? You look at you have an infant mortality rate that is 3.5 times higher than the national rate, right? When you look at the life expectancy rate on the national level, it's at about 78 or so. In that neighborhood, it's at about 65. So we can see lots of evidence, right, of structural violence and structural inequality. And I think the really good thing about the Baltimore riot, uprising, is the fact that they forced into the national discourse a conversation about structural violence and inequality.
So how should we view policing in low-income neighborhoods? Because it ultimately started from a policing incident.
Absolutely. I think policing in low-income, particularly low-income neighborhoods of communities of color, black and brown, has been contentious from the very beginning. It's a legacy that begins during the period of slavery. We see these kinds of examples happening across space and time. I think there is now an opportunity in the 21st century, given the data and the information that we now know, there's more of an opportunity to work more positively, work more constructively, with local communities, than it's ever been before.
Do you think white officers feel as if they have to be tougher in urban communities?
I do think unconscious bias can rule. I think it rules not only white officers but also black officers, and we see this institutionally. That's why we call it institutionalized racism. Whether we're looking in schools, whether we're looking at folk or professionals work in nonprofit organizations or agencies, whether we look at law enforcement, right? There's an institutional and structural culture which facilitates this kind of tension, particularly between folk who have less or low power, right? And in this case, it's low-income black communities.
Well, unfortunately, race still remains an issue in criminal justice, in the criminal justice system. You, last year, met with the Wilmington Police Department to talk to them about, I know sensitivity is not the word that they would prefer, but to talk to them about policing in neighborhoods like Baltimore. Would you say what's going on there could possibly happen here?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, particularly as senior research associate of the People's Report, Darrell Chambers, now a doctoral student at the University of Delaware, as he's been saying recently, we're one incident away in Wilmington, from having, what we saw with Freddie Gray, from having that kind of uprising take place. I think, the distrust in the neighborhood, given the efforts of Chief Cummings, who I'm a big fan of, definitely the mayor's office, the governor's office, city council. I think there is improved trust, right? There definitely is a kind of social cohesion or collective efficacy that's taken root on the ground, a type of organizing that's taken root on the ground over the last year or two in Wilmington that I've never seen before. I think there needs to be a lot more diversity training. I think the diversity training needs to include local residents. I think it was a great start last April, right? So each officer received 4 hours in training. Yeah. But it's, I think we need to build upon that momentum so we can all, bring about and see the change that we all want to see.
Okay, well, thank you. It's always a pleasure to have you on set. Yasser Payne, Associate Professor of Black American Studies at the University of Delaware. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
First is online at WHYY.org/first. You can find our interviews with Yasser Payne and Alan Levin when you click on this week's show. Past shows can always be found there, so you can watch it when you want.
It's been decades since Delaware had a significant forest fire, but the first state still plays a role in fighting them. Delaware education correspondent Avi Wolfman-Arendt joins us to explain how in this month's Teach Me report. Avi, did you fight some fires for us?
I did not actually fight some fires, but when big blazes break out, crews from around the country fly in to assist. Delaware's volunteers get ready for the summer fire season every year at a training summit called Fire Camp. As part of our ongoing Teach Me series, I take a look at the learning process that goes into becoming a wildland firefighter. Like many Americans, Eric Bergentine likes to spend his summers outdoors, often heading west to admire the natural splendor of our nation's greatest parks and forests.
If you're from the East Coast and you've never been out west, you can't even conceptualize the magnitude, the majestic nature of being in some of these places.
But Bergentine, who works for the Delaware Forest Service, doesn't travel for vacation. Quite the opposite.
Well, I get dropped off, via helicopter in the middle of nowhere and sleep on the ground for 14 days eating MREs and just camp sleeping under the stars.
This is the life of a wildland firefighter, and Bergentine is one of Delaware's best. When states out west need help controlling a blaze, Bergentine assembles crews of 20 from the first state to aid the cause. His future crewmates are here at Delaware's annual fire camp.
We're going to do a live firing exercise. We're going to do this prescribed fire on this 11.3 acre block. We're here on the lovely Redden State Forest.
All the students here have spent more than 60 hours in the classroom studying fire and wildland firefighting. At fire camp, students put their learning into action. They haul 45-pound packs, they practice firefighting scenarios, and they participate in what's called a live burn.
You'll actually see these flames tilt. You see the backing fire tilting toward it, and it's sucking it right together.
The purpose here is for students to get an up-close look at how fire behaves outdoors. They talk about wind direction, humidity, and the combustibility of various types of grasses. But the truth is, they don't do a whole lot. Fighting fire outdoors doesn't require the kind of quick-twitch action that structural firefighting requires.
And this is literally 180 degrees from what they do. Everything from the gear to the tactics to what's required to get the job done.
Out west, guys like Burkentine spend 14-hour days cutting down trees to deprive the fire of fuel, or searching the horizon for spot fires that may ignite beyond the established fire lines. It is a physical and mental grind, and nothing personifies the tedium better than what the firefighters call mopping up.
It's an art form. It's a monotonous art form. You may hate it. You may hate it for 14 days straight, but if you're on this crew, you're going to learn how to do it right.
Mopping up doesn't involve water. Instead, it consists of firefighters marching in a long line across charred terrain.
Moving the line! Moving the line!
They're looking for any remaining sparks and stamping them out when necessary. It isn't easy to get everyone to move in unison, and fighting a big blaze across hundreds of acres and dozens of days requires careful coordination.
So you're going to turn into the anchor while the pivot started, okay?
Unlike military units or police squads, these wildland firefighters only get a day or so to train together. Months from now, they might all get a call to reassemble, and then have as little as 12 hours to become a cohesive unit again.
When we start throwing spots, you start running around all over the place.
In that way, fire camp isn't so much about technical knowledge as it is about trying to build some camaraderie and trust in a really short period of time.
The one thing I like to impart on these people is you're getting blasted with all this factual knowledge and all this safety stuff, and there's, it seems like there's imminent danger, but you do develop a flow, and you want them to be able to develop that flow and work with you and impart in them that you're part of this team now. We want you to be part of this team. We want to take you in. We work better with you.
Wildland firefighting really is a team game. The crews have about 20 people on them, and if even one person can't do his or her job well or gets injured, the entire crew might be sent home.
Wow. So I have to ask, what was it like to see and feel those flames up close?
Really, more than anything, I was struck by the sound. I mean, even these little test fires had a pretty big crackle to them, and I asked one of the firefighters what it's like when you're on a mountain out west, and he said it sounds like a freight train roaring through.
Gosh, I can't imagine. So when the Delaware firefighters are out west, are they on the front lines?
Yes and no. A lot of times they will be right up next to the fire. They're not like the smoke jumpers who parachute in, but they will be right up next to the fire, digging fire lines, cutting down trees. And in fact, one of the guys told me that sometimes they have to jump through the flames to get through to a blackened area where the fire has already burned through all the shrubbery and trees.
Oh my gosh, that's scary stuff. Can't wait to see what you're doing next. Thanks so much, Avi. You can follow Avi's education reporting at newsworks.org/Delaware.
William D. White created hundreds of paintings, murals, and illustrations over his 40-year career. When White, who lived in the Penny Hill section of Wilmington, died in 1971, it seemed the world would forget the impact he made. The Biggs Museum in Dover has reintroduced White's work to the world, and that's our first experience this week.
We are reintroducing the work of William White to the general public. William White was this really reclusive artist. He studied at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, and in his early life he seemed to exhibit all the characteristics of a guy that was talented, wanted to go on and do professional things in the art world. But it seemed that the further he went in his life, the less interested he was in money, the more reclusive he became with society. People have these sort of memories of him wearing sort of threadbare clothing and looking sort of like a hobo about town. He seemed to live life to his own standards, and he seemed to live the way that he wanted to live. His house, this really sort of just really wild, almost kind of shack that was built on the property of his childhood home, became sort of an impromptu art center for these kids of the Penny Hill area. So in order to find a lot of the works that were featured in this show, we had to go to those kids because they all had a couple of drawings or a little painting or a portrait or pieces that he had made over the duration of their friendship with him. His major employer over the years was the Hercules Corporation. Hercules was sort of a spin-off of the DuPont company. So they did largely printing chemicals, so like printing inks, different kinds of papers. So those products were sort of featured in one trade catalog called the Papermaker. He literally created hundreds of illustrations over 40 years. And so when you flip through these trade magazines, there's a William White, there's a William White, there's a William White, you just sort of see them. But where those paintings ended up, where those drawings ended up, who knows? Another one William White did a lot of images for was Explosives Engineer. And this was literally a trade magazine for people in the mining industry or those individuals that were buying explosives. Now, this is a huge population. Back in the 1920s, 1930s, the mining industry, these are people that are going to buy explosives. This isn't the cover of Time Life magazine. So unless you had access to some of these trade magazines, you weren't really going to see his work. He wanted to show laborers. He wanted to show the conditions of people actually working in mines, working with explosives. He's this great character that you're seeing depicting people of color in like the 1920s and 1930s in these fantastic paintings and murals. Nobody was doing that back then, very few. I hope that this will fuel other people's ideas about what makes great art. Where are you finding this great art? You know, you come across some great find at a resale shop or in a flea market, and I hope that it spurs people's imagination about who was this person, what was their training, what was their background, why were they creating this artwork, how much more is out there? This is what we do within a museum. We bring back to life that which is sort of falling by the wayside a lot of the time. We sort of protect and save the world one piece at a time. I hope people are looking in their own backyards and thinking about really how inspiring, how generous the art world has been to Delaware, and how many more William Whites are in this community.
It does make you wonder how many more artists like William White are out there. There will be many events at the Biggs on this artist through June 21st. Go to biggsmuseum.org to learn more.
Next week, we take on the strange and quirky parts of Delaware. We'll give you a preview of Delaware. Don't forget our special Monday night, the 100-Mile Monument. That will air at 9 p.m. on WHYY-TV.
Definitely labors of love. Well, be sure to tune in and come along for a ride down the DuPont Highway. That is first for this week. We thank you for watching. For Mark Eichman, Nichelle Polston, and Avi Wolfman-Arendt, I'm Shirley Min. Have a great week.